The girl in chains. The cold metal walls of the cell dripped with moisture, the air thick with the stench of rust and damp stone. Ryla sat in the corner, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the flickering red light above the door. The dim glow cast eerie shadows across the cramped space. She didn't know how long she had been here. Days, weeks, time had lost meaning. Her wrists ached from the heavy metal cuffs that dug into her skin. The Xarn slavers never removed them. To them, she was nothing, just another weak, forgotten prisoner. A loud clang echoed through the corridor outside, followed by the deep, guttural voices of the Xarn guards. Ryla tensed, heart pounding. When the guard spoke, it only meant one thing: pain. She pressed herself against the cold wall, trying to make herself smaller. She had seen what happened to the others. When the guards grew bored, they picked a prisoner and dragged them out. Some returned, barely able to walk. Others never came back at all. "Humans are coming," a whisper reached her ears. Ryla's head snapped up. The voice belonged to Jack, an old prisoner in the next cell. His voice was weak, but there was something in it, something she had never heard before. Hope. She shifted closer to the rusted bars separating them. "What did you say?" she whispered. "I heard the guards talking. They're afraid," Jack said, his voice trembling. "A human is hunting them. He has already destroyed 3 Xarn bases." Ryla frowned. A human. She had never seen one before, only heard stories. The Xarns hated them, feared them. "Why would a human come here?" she asked. Jack coughed, his breathing labored. Humans never abandon their own. Ryla froze. Their own. But there were no humans here, only Xarns and their slaves. A loud explosion suddenly shook the ground. Dust fell from the ceiling, and a deep alarm blared through the facility. The guards shouted outside, their voices filled with panic. Boom! Another explosion, this time closer. The ground beneath her shook violently. The lights flickered, then went dark. Chaos. Ryla clutched the bars, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Something was happening. Something big. Then she heard it. The sound of footsteps. Not the heavy, clanking boots of the Xarn guards. No, these steps were different. Slow, steady, heavy with purpose. A broken scream echoed through the corridor. The sound of metal clashing, bones crunching. Ryla's hands tightened around the bars. Was it him? The human? Another explosion rocked the walls, and suddenly, the thick steel doors of the prison hall slammed open. Smoke and fire poured through the entrance, and for the first time, Ryla saw fear in the eyes of the Xarn guards. A massive figure stepped through the smoke. A human. He was taller than she expected, clad in dark battle-worn armor, his face hidden beneath a visor that glowed a deep crimson. He carried a massive weapon, a brutal-looking rifle with a jagged blade attached to the end. The Xarn commander snarled, raising his plasma rifle. "Kill the Deathwalker." Before the Xarns could fire, the human moved like a shadow. Bang! One shot. A Xarn fell. Slash! The blade tore through another. The human was a force of destruction. Every movement was precise, efficient, deadly. One guard tried to run. He never made it. Within seconds, the Xarns lay in pools of their own blood. The corridor fell into silence. Ryla couldn't breathe. Then the human turned his head and looked directly at her. She froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. His visor gleamed in the dim light, unreadable, unshaken. Then he took a step closer, scanning the row of cages. His voice was deep, cold, unforgiving. "You're not Xarn." It wasn't a question. Ryla's throat felt dry. She managed a weak nod. The human raised his weapon, but not at her. At the locks. With a single, deafening shot, the cage door burst open. Ryla flinched, her heart hammering as the metal bars crumbled before her. She was free. For the first time in her life. But before she could step forward, the human spoke again. "If you want to live, stay behind me." Then, from the depths of the prison, more footsteps. Louder, heavier, hundreds of them. The Xarns were coming. And this time, they weren't afraid. They were angry. Ryla's hands clenched into fists. She had two choices: stay in the cage, or follow the human into the storm. She made her choice, and she ran after him. Humanity's wrath. The silence after the battle was unnatural. The air smelled of burnt metal and blood, the floor littered with the twisted bodies of Xarn guards. The dim emergency lights flickered overhead, barely illuminating the human warrior standing in the center of the carnage. His dark armor was scared and battle-worn, his crimson visor reflecting the flames from the distant explosions. Ryla stood behind him, her wrists still bruised from the chains that had bound her for so long. She had never seen a fight like this before. She had seen Xarns crush their enemies, break them, enslave them, but never had she seen them fall so fast. Never had she seen them afraid. And yet, they had feared him. The Deathwalker, that was what they called him. The human turned his head slightly, as if listening to something distant, something she could not hear. His weapon, a massive rifle with a jagged blade attachment, dripped with Xarn blood. He was still, but not relaxed, like a predator waiting for its prey to make the next move. Then came the sound. A deep rhythmic thudding. Not footsteps, marching. Ryla's stomach twisted as the sound grew louder, echoing through the halls. The Xarn reinforcements had arrived. The human shifted, adjusting his grip on his weapon. Ryla swallowed hard. "We have to run," she whispered. "There are too many." The human didn't move. Did he not hear her? Then, finally, he spoke. His voice was deep, calm, and completely unshaken. "Good." Ryla's breath caught in her throat. "What?" Before she could say anything, the massive steel doors at the end of the corridor exploded inward. A wave of Xarn enforcers stormed in, their armored boots slamming against the metal floor. Plasma rifles gleamed under the flickering lights, red targeting sights locking onto their lone enemy. At the center of the squad, a Xarn war chief stepped forward. His armor was heavier, reinforced with thick plates, his 4 black eyes narrowing in rage. His deep, guttural voice shook the walls. "Human," he roared. "You dare set foot in Xarn territory. You are alone. Outnumbered. Outmatched." The human didn't react. He simply tilted his head, as if considering something. Then, slowly, he raised his weapon. "Outnumbered," he repeated, almost amused. "Maybe. Outmatched." He shook his head. "Not even close." And then he attacked. The battle begins. Ryla had never seen anything move like him. The moment the first Xarn fired, the human was already gone, a blur of motion, weaving between plasma bolts with unnatural speed. Bang! A single shot to the head. One Xarn fell. Slash! His blade tore through another, cutting deep into armored flesh. The Xarns roared in fury, their weapons lighting up the darkness. But the human was unstoppable. He moved like a ghost, dodging, striking, tearing through them like they were nothing. The war chief growled in frustration. "Hold your ground. He's just one." But it didn't matter. One was enough. Ryla pressed herself against the wall, watching in awe. The Xarns were warriors, feared across the galaxy. But against this single human, they were nothing but prey. The last Xarn soldier tried to run. The human caught him. With a single, brutal motion, he lifted the Xarn by the throat and slammed him against the wall. The alien's body went limp. Silence. The human exhaled, his breath steady despite the bloodshed. He turned back toward Ryla, his visor still unreadable. Then the war chief, the last one standing, laughed. Ryla's eyes widened. Why was he laughing? The Xarn spat blood onto the floor and tapped a control panel on his gauntlet. "You think you have won, human. He sneered. "You are nothing but an insect. Do you know what we do to insects?" The facility shook beneath them, and then Ryla heard it. A deep metallic roar. The walls cracked, dust falling from above. The sound of something massive moving echoed through the corridors. Heavy mechanical footsteps. Gears grinding. A monstrous machine awakening. The human's grip on his weapon tightened. Ryla's heart pounded. What was coming? The war chief grinned, his fanged teeth gleaming under the flickering lights. "You will die here, Deathwalker." And then, from the shadows of the corridor, it emerged. A Xarn war machine. It was 3 times the size of a human, its body made of thick black steel, glowing red veins pulsing across its surface. Its arms were massive cannons, and its eyes, cold, lifeless sensors, locked onto the human like a predator spotting its prey. A low, mechanical voice rumbled through the hall. "Target identified. Eliminating." It raised its arm. A deafening blast tore through the corridor. The explosion sent Ryla flying, crashing against the cold metal floor. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs, pain shooting through her ribs. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't see through the smoke, and then through the fire and dust. The human stood up. His armor was scorched, his visor cracked, but he was still standing. And when he spoke, his voice was colder than death itself. "My turn." Then, with terrifying speed, he charged straight at the war machine. The rescue. Smoke curled through the air, thick with the scent of burnt metal and charred flesh. The walls trembled, the very foundation of the prison shaking from the last explosion. Ryla coughed, struggling to regain her balance, her body sore from the blast. Her ears rang, her vision blurred. And then she saw him. Through the flickering flames and twisted wreckage, the human still stood. His armor was scorched, deep scratches carved into the metal plating, but he was alive. He rolled his shoulder, cracking his neck, as if the explosion was nothing more than an inconvenience. His cracked visor glowed dimly as he set his sights on the war machine, the towering behemoth blocking their only escape. The mechanical monster hummed with power, its massive cannons heating up again, preparing another blast. Its crimson sensors locked onto its target. Hostile detected. A deep whirring sound filled the air as the machine's arms shifted, transforming into massive plasma cannons. Ryla's pulse spiked. The last blast had been enough to tear through steel walls. If it hit them again, there would be nothing left. She braced for impact. But the human was already moving. The battle against the machine. In a blur of speed, he rushed forward, faster than anything she had ever seen. One moment, he was standing still. The next, he was gone. The war machine fired. A blinding plasma blast ripped through the air, melting the floor in its path. But it hit nothing. The human had already dodged, rolling to the side with inhuman reflexes. Before the machine could adjust, he leaped onto its massive leg, climbing up its armored frame like a predator scaling its prey. His boots slammed against the metal plating as he reached its back, gripping onto an exposed panel. With a vicious yank, he tore a chunk of its outer shell clean off, exposing the glowing core beneath. The machine roared, as if in pain. System breach detected. Engaging countermeasures. Sharp metal spikes shot out from its frame, trying to impale the human, but he had already jumped, flipping off the machine and landing in a perfect crouch behind it. Bang! A single shot from his rifle pierced the exposed core. The result was instantaneous. Electricity surged through the war machine's body, sparks exploding from its joints. The red glow in its sensors flickered. Its massive arms twitched uncontrollably, its heavy frame shaking under its own weight. Then, in a final, deafening shriek, the machine collapsed, its massive bulk crashing to the floor. Silence followed. For a long moment, all Ryla could do was stare. This wasn't possible. She had spent her entire life watching the Xarns dominate, conquer, destroy. She had seen them crush entire species beneath their rule. And now, before her very eyes, a single human had taken down one of their greatest war machines. With nothing but his own skill. The Karns had lied. They weren't invincible. They could be beaten. The human finally exhaled, lowering his weapon. He turned toward her, his visor cracked but still glowing faintly. "Can you walk?" he asked. Ryla snapped out of her daze. Her body ached, but she forced herself to stand. "Why, yes." He nodded once. "Then let's move." Escape from the prison. The alarm screamed overhead. With the war machine down, the Xarn soldiers had regrouped, and they were coming. Through the corridors, Ryla could hear the heavy stomps of hundreds of boots, the guttural roars of Xarn warriors preparing for revenge. "They're closing in," she whispered. The human was already on the move, scanning the hallways. "They'll expect us to head for the docking bay." His voice was calm, calculating. "So we won't." Ryla frowned. "Then where?" Boom! The far wall exploded, and a new wave of Xarn enforcers flooded into the corridor, weapons blazing. The human grabbed her wrist. "Run." They bolted down the opposite hall, dodging falling debris as the entire prison shook around them. "There's an old maintenance tunnel ahead," the human called over the chaos. "If we reach it, we can get out before the station locks down." Ryla's breath burned in her lungs as she pushed herself forward, her feet pounding against the cold metal floor. The Xarns were relentless, their shouts echoing behind them, plasma fire whizzing past. Then, up ahead, Ryla saw it. A large metal grate, barely big enough for a person to squeeze through. The human didn't hesitate. He kicked it open, shoving Ryla inside first. "Go." She scrambled through the tight space, her body pressing against the cold steel as she crawled forward. Then, suddenly, pain. A burning sensation tore through her shoulder. She gasped, falling forward, barely catching herself before she hit the ground. She glanced back. One of the Xarn shots had grazed her, leaving a scorching wound on her arm. The human was right behind her, his gaze locking onto the injury for only a second before he lifted his rifle again. Bang! The last pursuing Xarn fell, its body slumping against the tunnel entrance. The human reached her side, pulling a small injector from his belt. "This will numb the pain." He pressed it to her shoulder before she could protest. A cool sensation spread through her arm, and the pain faded almost instantly. She blinked up at him. Why are you helping me?" For the first time, the human hesitated. Then he spoke, his voice quieter. "Because you don't belong here." Something in Ryla's chest tightened. Before she could say anything else, a deep rumbling echoed through the tunnels. The station's auto-lockdown was activating. The human grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. "We're not safe yet. Keep moving." And together, they ran, toward freedom. The chase. The tunnel rumbled around them as Ryla sprinted after the human, her breath ragged, her legs screaming in protest. The cold steel walls blurred past, and the sound of blaring alarms and distant explosions filled the air. Behind them, the Xarn forces were not giving up. Their guttural roars echoed through the tunnels, the clanking of heavy boots growing louder. Plasma bolts whizzed past, striking the walls and leaving molten holes where metal had once been. Ryla's lungs burned, but she kept going. She had no choice. The human led the way, his movements precise and calculated. Every step was measured, every turn executed without hesitation. He had been in situations like this before, many times. For him, this was just another battle. For Ryla, this was life and death. A deep voice thundered behind them. The Xarn commander leading the hunt. "They're in the maintenance tunnels. Cut them off at the docks. The human will not escape." Ryla's stomach twisted. The Xarns were already moving to block their exit. "We're trapped." But the human didn't slow down. He spoke, his voice calm despite the chaos. "We need to get out of the tunnels before they seal us in." Up ahead, a heavy blast door loomed. The end of the tunnel. Ryla's heart leaped. Freedom. But then, hiss. The door slammed shut before they could reach it. Ryla skidded to a stop, panic flaring through her chest. They locked us in. She turned to the human, expecting him to look defeated. But he didn't. Instead, he reached to his belt and pulled out a small black device. A shaped charge. Step back. Ryla didn't need to be told twice. The human slapped the explosive onto the door, twisted a dial, and took a few steps back. Boom. The blast shook the tunnel, sending a wave of heat rushing over them. Smoke and debris filled the air. When it cleared, the door was nothing but a smoldering hole. The human didn't even pause. He moved. Ryla followed, her heart pounding. Out in the open, they emerged onto an open platform, high above the lower levels of the Xarn stronghold. Below them, dozens of Xarn troops were mobilizing, vehicles moving into position, gunships preparing for takeoff. But that wasn't the worst part. Ryla's eyes widened. A Xarn battleship was blocking the sky. It loomed above them like a metal beast, its hull bristling with turrets and energy shields. They were sealing off all exits. Ryla's breath hitched. We're trapped. There's nowhere to run. She turned to the human. What now? He didn't answer. Instead, he scanned the platform, his gaze locking onto something at the far end. A row of stolen hoverbikes. Ryla's stomach flipped. Oh no. The human moved. Fast. Move, he barked. They sprinted across the platform, dodging behind crates as Xarn soldiers spotted them. There they are. Shoot them down. Gunfire exploded around them, plasma bolts scorching the metal floor. Ryla reached the hoverbike just as the human jumped onto one. She had never ridden one before, but there was no time to hesitate. She threw herself onto the seat, gripping the handlebars. The moment her fingers touched the ignition, the bike roared to life beneath her. The human revved his engine. Stay close. Then, they launched forward. The chase begins. The air rushed past Ryla's face as the bike shot forward, speeding down the narrow metal bridge that connected the platforms. Behind them, Xarn scout ships lifted off, their engines roaring to life. They're sending flyers after us. Ryla shouted. The human didn't look back. Then we'll have to lose them. The Xarn gunships opened fire. Boom. A plasma round struck the bridge behind them, sending chunks of metal spiraling into the abyss below. Ryla gritted her teeth. If they got hit, there would be nothing left of them. The human took a sharp turn onto a steep vertical ramp, shooting up toward the docking bay. Ryla followed, gripping the controls for dear life. But the Xarns were faster. The gunships closed in, their heavy cannons warming up for another shot. The human glanced back, his visor flashing with calculation. Hold on. He suddenly jerked his bike sideways, spinning in midair, and fired a single, perfect shot. The bullet struck the cockpit of the nearest gunship, shattering its sensor array. The pilot lost control. The ship spun wildly, then crashed into the bridge. Boom. The explosion lit up the sky, flames and metal raining down. Ryla gaped. Did he just keep moving? She didn't need to be told twice. They sped forward, dodging between massive cargo crates and burning wreckage. Their only goal, escape. The final stretch. The exit was in sight, a massive launch tunnel leading to the outside. Ryla's heart soared. We're almost there. But then, a shadow blocked the exit. A Xarn warlord stood in their path, massive and armored, holding a heavy plasma cannon. Ryla's stomach dropped. The warlord raised the weapon, his voice booming. You will not leave this place alive. He fired. The plasma shot toward them, unstoppable, unavoidable. Ryla's breath caught. This is it. But the human. He accelerated, directly toward the blast. For a split second, everything slowed. Then, he leaped off the bike. The plasma struck the vehicle, sending it into a fiery explosion. But the human had already moved, flipping through the air straight toward the warlord. Ryla barely had time to process what she was seeing. Before the warlord could react, the human's blade was already at his throat. A single, precise strike. The warlord collapsed, his body hitting the ground with a thud. The human landed beside him, smoke curling from his armor. He turned to Ryla. "Get to the ship. Now." She didn't argue. They sprinted to the last remaining Xarn fighter, throwing themselves inside. The engines roared to life, the control panel flashing with warnings. Ryla turned to the human. "Can you fly this?" He grinned. "Watch me." The ship lifted off, engines burning as they shot toward the stars. Behind them, the Xarn station erupted into flames. Ryla watched the chaos shrink in the distance. She had escaped. She was free. But as she turned to the human, she realized something else. This was only the beginning. The last stand. The Xarn station burned behind them, the fires raging across its surface as it crumbled into oblivion. The stolen fighter ship cut through the black void of space, its thrusters leaving a trail of blue fire in its wake. Inside the cockpit, Ryla's heart pounded. She had never been on a starship before, certainly not one this fast. The controls blinked with warnings in Xarn script, but she barely had time to process them. Because they weren't alone. A deep alarm blared through the ship's systems. Incoming hostiles detected. Ryla's stomach dropped. Through the wide glass viewport, she saw them. Xarn warships emerging from the darkness, their red engines burning like vengeful eyes. There were dozens. Massive battleships, smaller interceptors, and the worst of all, a Xarn dreadnought. It hovered in the distance, its gigantic metal form blotting out the stars, a fortress in the sky. And from its underbelly, something far worse began to awaken. The planet cracker cannon. Ryla had heard the legends, tales whispered among the enslaved, a weapon designed to wipe entire colonies from existence. Her hands clenched the seat. They're going to destroy everything. The human, Commander Dorian Kane, sat in the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the controls. His expression was unreadable, his crimson visor cracked but still glowing faintly. He was calm. Too calm. "They're trying to stop us from escaping," he said, his voice even. "And from calling for help." Ryla turned to him, desperation rising. "So what do we do?" Kane glanced at her, then at the approaching fleet. His grip on the controls tightened. "We fight. A battle among the stars." The first Xarn interceptors descended upon them, sleek and predatory, their plasma cannons glowing that deadly green. "Hold on." Kane yanked the control stick hard, sending their stolen fighter into a sudden, twisting maneuver that sent Ryla's stomach flipping. The ship spun between enemy fire, narrowly dodging a volley of plasma bolts that tore past them, scorching the void. Ryla gritted her teeth. She wasn't a warrior. She wasn't like him. But she had a choice. Sit there, or fight back. Her eyes darted to the co-pilot's seat. The controls were foreign, but she had seen Xarn officers use them before. She had watched. She had learned. She reached forward and slammed her fingers onto the targeting system. The guns powered up. Kane glanced at her, just for a second. "You know how to use those." Ryla exhaled sharply. "Guess I'm about to find out." She fired. Twin plasma cannons blazed to life, and the first Xarn interceptor exploded into a ball of fire, debris scattering through space. Ryla gasped. She had actually hit it. There was no time to celebrate. The other ships were swarming, circling them like wolves, their shots getting closer and closer. Kane growled, "We need to break through their formation." But before they cooled, boom! A massive shockwave hit them, shaking the entire ship. Ryla's stomach lurched as the console flashed red warnings. They had been hit. A Xarn battleship had fired a direct cannon blast, crippling their left thruster. The ship was now spinning out of control, heading straight toward the dreadnought's tractor field. Ryla's breath caught. If they got pulled in, they were dead. Kane, the human, snarled in frustration, yanking at the controls, trying to force the ship into a recovery spin. But it was too late. The gravitational field of the dreadnought grabbed them, dragging their ship toward the massive enemy vessel. A deep mechanical voice rang over their radio, cold and victorious. "Human, you are finished." They were being pulled into the belly of the beast. Inside the lion's den, the stolen ship crashed into the docking bay of the dreadnought, its impact sending metal debris scattering across the floor. Before Ryla could even react, Sarn soldiers swarmed in. Kane moved first. He burst from the cockpit like a storm of death, his rifle roaring as he fired, taking down 3 Sarns before they could blink. Ryla scrambled after him, her hands shaking as she grabbed a fallen blaster. She wasn't a warrior, but she wouldn't die like a slave. She fired. The shot struck a Sarn square in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. Another turned toward her, raising his blade. Kane intercepted, cutting the alien down with a single brutal strike. The human turned to her, his voice sharp. "Stay behind me." They fought their way deeper into the dreadnought, moving toward the control center. They had one chance: disable the ship's main systems before the planet cracker cannon could fire. But time was running out. The massive cannon was charging, its glowing energy core pulsing brighter with each second. Ryla's hands clenched into fists. If they didn't stop it, an entire colony would be wiped from existence. The final gambit. They reached the core chamber, a towering room filled with energy conduits and control panels. And there, waiting for them, the Sarn overlord. He stood twice as tall as Kane, his armor adorned with ancient battle scars. His 4 eyes gleamed with hatred, his deep voice filled with arrogance. "You have fought well, human, but this ends here." Kane didn't hesitate. He charged. The overlord met him in a clash of steel, their blades sparking as they struck. The room shook as they fought, their movements blurring with deadly precision. Ryla didn't wait. She rushed to the control panel, her fingers moving instinctively. She had watched the Sarns operate this system for years. Now she would shut it down. But before she could, the overlord threw Kane across the chamber, slamming him against the wall. The human groaned, struggling to rise. The overlord turned to Ryla, his blade gleaming. "I should have killed you in the cells." He lunged. Ryla ducked, grabbing a loose cable, and jammed it into the console. The system overloaded. Sparks exploded from the core as the ship's power grid collapsed. The planet cracker cannon flickered, then shut down completely. The overlord's roar of rage was cut short, as Kane's blade sliced clean through him. The battle was over. The dreadnought was crippling itself, alarms blaring. Kane grabbed Ryla's arm. "We need to go. Now." They sprinted to the escape pod, launching into space, as the massive Sarn dreadnought exploded behind them. Ryla looked at the burning wreckage, her heart hammering. They had won. But the war was far from over. Because now she knew, humanity never abandons its own. The fall of the Sarns. The debris of the destroyed dreadnought drifted silently through the black void, glowing remnants of its once mighty structure spinning off into the cold expanse of space. For a moment, there was stillness. No gunfire, no alarms, no cries of battle. Just the quiet, eerie hum of a battlefield after the storm. Ryla floated in the escape pod, staring out of the viewport. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she watched the enormous chunks of metal twist and tumble, their jagged edges catching the light of a distant star. Her reflection in the glass looked just as haunted as she felt. Behind her, Commander Kane sat in the cramped pod's control chair, scanning the readouts. His visor was still cracked, the red glow dimmer than before, but his posture remained unyielding, his focus unwavering. "Don't get comfortable," he said, his voice sharp, pulling Ryla's attention away from the ruins. "We've still got a fight ahead of us." Ryla frowned. But we destroyed their ship. The cannon was only one piece. Kane interrupted. He pointed out the viewport, where the wreckage of the dreadnought floated ominously. The Xarns have more. They always have more. They'll send reinforcements, ships twice that size if they have to. And when they find out who we are, they'll come with everything they've got. Ryla swallowed hard. She hadn't thought about what would come next. The cannon was gone, but the Xarns were still out there, and now they'd be angry. So what do we do? She asked quietly. Kane's visor turned toward her. His voice was grim, but determined. We fight smarter. We hit them before they can regroup. Before Ryla could respond, a harsh alarm sounded from the pod's console. Kane moved quickly, tapping at the controls. His shoulders stiffened. "Speak of the devil," he muttered. Ryla leaned forward, her stomach tightening. Through the viewport, she saw them, a fleet of Xarn warships. They came out of the darkness like a pack of wolves, their sleek, menacing forms gliding through space with eerie grace. Their weapons were already primed, their engines glowing a deep blood red. And at the center of the formation was a massive flagship, even larger than the dreadnought they'd just destroyed. Its hull gleamed with blackened steel, and its forward batteries bristled with heavy plasma cannons. The Xarn emblem, a jagged red claw, burned brightly on its side. Ryla felt her chest tighten. There's no way we can fight all of them. Kane didn't flinch. Not alone. But we're not alone anymore. He pressed a control on the console, and the pod's comm system crackled to life. "This is Commander Kane. All human forces in the sector, this is a priority broadcast. The Xarn fleet has regrouped. We need immediate support at Grid 12-4. If we don't stop them now, there won't be anything left to save. I repeat, all forces, Grid 12-4, now." He cut the transmission and turned to Ryla. "Help is coming. We just need to hold out long enough." Ryla looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if they don't come?" Kane's visor glinted faintly as he straightened. "They will." The turning point. The Xarn fleet moved quickly, their formation tightening as they closed in on the escape pod. Missile locks flashed across the pod's console, the targeting system screeching warnings that echoed through the cramped space. Kane's hands flew over the controls. "We can't outrun them, so we'll have to outmaneuver them." He flipped the pod into a steep dive, the tiny vessel spinning wildly as plasma bolts streaked past. Ryla gripped her seat, her knuckles white. Every move seemed impossible, every dodge, every turn. Yet Kane managed to pull them through, his reflexes honed to perfection. Then, just as the lead Xarn ship's weapons locked onto the pod, something massive dropped out of hyperspace. Ryla's heart leaped into her throat. A human cruiser. Its hull shone like polished iron, massive cannons sliding into position as it turned directly into the Xarn fleet. The Xarns hesitated for the briefest moment, their formation faltering. Then more ships appeared, a wave of human reinforcements. Cruisers, destroyers, and even a few stealth corvettes surged into the battlefield, their weapons already blazing. Plasma beams and railgun rounds lit up the darkness as the two fleets clashed in a chaotic, breathtaking display. Ryla stared out the viewport in awe. The Xarns had always seemed unstoppable, their warships untouchable. But now the humans had arrived, and they weren't holding back. Kane's voice broke through her thoughts. "We're not done yet. We need to get aboard one of those ships. This pod won't last long in a fight like this." Ryla nodded, her chest tightening. "What's the plan?" "We stick to their blind spots and dock with the nearest cruiser. Once we're aboard, we'll have a better chance of taking out their flagship." "Take out their flagship," Ryla repeated, her voice rising in disbelief. "Are you insane? That thing is twice the size of anything I've ever seen." Kane tilted his head slightly. "Good thing we brought friends." The fall begins. With the human reinforcements now fully engaged, the tide of the battle began to turn. The Tarn ships, once relentless, now found themselves outmaneuvered. Human fighters swarmed their cruisers, landing precise, surgical strikes on weak points. Ryla watched as one of the Xarn warships split apart, its engines exploding in a fiery bloom. The sight sent a shiver through her. The Xarns were falling, something she had never thought possible. Kane guided the pod expertly, weaving through the chaos until they reached the human cruiser's docking bay. The pod landed with a sharp clang, and the hatch hissed open. Ryla hesitated for a moment before stepping out, her feet meeting the cold deck of the cruiser. The air smelled of oil and ozone, a reminder that this was still a battlefield. She turned to Kane, who was already striding toward the command deck. "What's the plan now?" she asked. He glanced back at her. "We take the fight to them." As they entered the bustling command center, Ryla felt the weight of what was happening. Humans were everywhere, working with precision, calling out orders, coordinating strikes. The sheer scale of the operation was overwhelming. But as the Tarn flagship loomed on the main view screen, Ryla realized the battle was far from over. The Xarns weren't going down without a fight. A new beginning. The battle was over. The final explosion of the Xarn flagship echoed across the comm channels, a distant, muffled boom that left only silence in its wake. On board the human cruiser, the crew erupted into cheers, their voices cutting through the tense, metallic hum of the command deck. Ryla stood motionless near one of the observation windows, staring at the wreckage that now floated aimlessly among the stars. Pieces of the Tarn fleet, once feared, once thought indomitable, now drifted like lifeless debris. The fires that had once raged across their hulls were dying out, replaced by the cold, unfeeling void. It didn't feel real. For the first time in her life, Ryla was free. No more chains. No more dark cells. No more Xarn overlords dictating her every breath. Yet the weight in her chest didn't disappear. It settled, heavy and unfamiliar. Freedom was something she had dreamed of, but now that it was here, it felt so much more. Kane's voice broke the stillness. "You did well." Ryla turned. He stood near the main console, his cracked visor finally removed. His face, scarred, worn, but calm, was illuminated by the soft glow of the screens. His sharp, calculating eyes softened slightly as he looked at her. "You held your ground," he continued. "Most people wouldn't have. They would have run or given up." Ryla shook her head. "I didn't do much." Kane stepped closer, his expression firm. "You fought when it mattered. You saved lives. More than you know." Ryla opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Did she really believe that? The image of the Xarn prisoners back in the cells flashed in her mind. They were all still there, trapped, waiting for a savior who might never come. "What happens to the others?" she asked. Her voice was quiet but steady. "The ones we couldn't save." Kane's jaw tightened. He looked away for a moment, as if weighing his words. "We go back for them," he said finally. "But not yet. Right now, the Xarns are broken, scattered. If we push too soon, we risk losing everything we've gained. We need time. Time to regroup, rebuild, and come back stronger." Ryla's fists clenched at her sides. She knew he was right. Charging back into the heart of Xarn territory now would be suicide. But that didn't make it any easier. She hated the thought of leaving anyone behind. "What about me?" she asked after a long pause. Kane's gaze met hers. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then he took a step forward, his voice steady. "You've got a choice now," he said. "For the first time in your life, no one's going to tell you what to do. You can go back home, if you want. Start fresh. Leave all of this behind." Ryla frowned. "And if I don't want to leave it behind?" Kane raised an eyebrow. "You want to stay?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I don't want to sit on the sidelines. Not anymore. I can't go back to feeling powerless. I don't even know if I can go back at all." Kane studied her for a moment, then nodded. "If you stay, it won't be easy. Training will be brutal. Fighting the Xarns isn't just a battle of weapons. It's a battle of minds, endurance, and willpower. You'll need to be stronger than you've ever been before. Ryla's voice didn't waver. I'm ready to try. Kane gave her a rare, faint smile. We'll see about that. The first step. The cruiser docked at a nearby human station, one of the largest in the sector. It was a city in space, a bustling hub filled with pilots, soldiers, and technicians. The air buzzed with energy, conversations in countless languages blending into a constant hum. Ryla stepped out of the docking bay and into the station's main corridor. The floor was smooth and polished, the walls lined with holographic displays announcing fleet movements, recruitment notices, and interstellar trade deals. The sheer scale of the place left her momentarily stunned. Kane walked ahead of her, his stride confident and purposeful. Ryla hurried to keep up, her eyes darting around at the unfamiliar surroundings. Where are we going? She asked. Kane didn't look back. To get you started. They passed through security checkpoints, past clusters of soldiers in their sharp uniforms and engineers hunched over datapads. Ryla felt out of place in her worn clothes, her bruised arms still aching from the battle. But no one paid her any attention. Eventually, they reached a set of heavy doors. Kane pressed his palm to a scanner, and the doors slid open with a hiss. Inside was a vast training facility. Rows of recruits stood at attention, their expressions serious as instructors barked orders. The air was thick with the sound of boots hitting the ground, of blasters firing at holographic targets, of heavy breathing as soldiers pushed through intense drills. Kane stopped just inside the doorway and turned to her. This is where it begins, he said. If you're serious about joining the fight, you'll train here. You'll learn to defend yourself, to lead, and to stand against the Xarns, or anyone else, without hesitation. Ryla swallowed hard. She had imagined what it would be like to fight, but seeing it in action, hearing the instructor's commands, feeling the raw energy of the recruits, it was overwhelming. But it was also exhilarating. Kane crossed his arms. You can still walk away. Ryla straightened. I'm not walking away. Kane nodded. Then you'd better keep up. Because out there, he gestured toward the recruits, the sound of a sergeant shouting, faster, move it, echoing through the room. There's no room for hesitation. Ryla stepped forward, past Kane, and into the training ground. It was the first step of a new life. A life of fighting, of defying the odds, of standing against the enemies who had once controlled her every move. The first step of her new beginning.